The silence of a Saturday afternoon is a fragile, cultivated thing. My house was a sanctuary of this silence, a place where the only sounds were the soft rustle of a page turning and the distant, rhythmic hum of the city breathing. I sat in the library, the scent of lemon oil and old paper a familiar comfort, the weight of a leather-bound book resting in my lap. Light streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, silent constellations. This was my order, my peace, a world built on clean lines, quiet afternoons, and the unspoken agreements that hold a long marriage together. The knock on the front door was an impertinence. It was not the gentle tap of a neighbor or the brisk rap of a courier. It was a firm, deliberate sound, a summons that seemed to know I was there, waiting in the quiet. I placed my book, open, on the mahogany table beside me, my place marked by a silk ribbon. I felt a flicker of annoyance, not alarm. My world was too well fortified for alarm. As I walked across the gleaming hardwood floors, my bare feet silent on the polished wood, I imagined a salesperson with a misguided sense of hope, or a delivery meant for the house down the street. When I opened the door, the world tilted on its axis. She was young, of course. Youth was the first thing I registered, a raw, unapologetic youth that seemed to suck the very light from the afternoon. Her eyes, dark and wide, held a defiance that was almost breathtaking. But beneath it, I saw something else, a quiet desperation that clung to her like a second skin. She was beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful, all kinetic energy and unpredictable power. But it was not her face that held my gaze. It was what she was holding in her hands. It was my midnight blue silk negligee, a gift from him years ago for an anniversary I could barely remember. I hadn't seen it in 6 months, assuming it had been lost at the dry cleaners or misplaced in the back of a drawer, a casualty of a life lived on autopilot. But here it was. The silk shimmered in the daylight, a sliver of captured night. The scent reached me then, before she even moved. A sweet, musky perfume I did not recognize, woven inextricably with the familiar, faint scent of my husband's cologne. It was proof, tangible and aromatic, of a betrayal I had suspected but never allowed myself to name. Her hands, unadorned and steady, offered it forward. It was not an apology or a confession. It was a presentation, a trophy. My own hands moved of their own accord, rising to accept the offering. The silk was cool, impossibly soft. But as my fingers brushed against the fabric, I felt it, a faint residual warmth, the warmth of another woman's body, a body that had just hours or perhaps minutes ago been wrapped in my silk, in my life, next to my husband. The piece of clothing was no longer mine. It was a shared relic, a testament to a secret world I was never meant to enter. I stood there, the silk pooling in my hands, a cold weight in the pit of my stomach. The silence stretched between us, thick and heavy with everything that could not be said. I looked from the negligee back to her face. The defiance in her eyes was still there, but it was tempered now by a plea. It was a look that did not ask for forgiveness. It asked for something far more complex, something I could not yet comprehend. She had not come here to destroy my world. She had come here for a reason that was written in the desperate set of her jaw and the tremor in her hands that she tried so hard to conceal. I could have slammed the door. The sane, predictable part of me screamed to do it, to shut out the storm she represented and retreat back into my quiet, orderly library. I could have thrown the tainted silk in her face and watched her composure finally break. That would have been the right reaction, the one expected of a wife in my position. But a different instinct took over, a cold, crystalline curiosity that was sharper and more compelling than rage. I needed to understand the architecture of my own ruin. I needed to see the pieces she held in her hands. So I stepped back. I pulled the heavy oak door open wider, the movement slow and deliberate. It was not a welcome. It was an invitation to a reckoning. She did not smile, but a flicker of something, relief, triumph, fear, crossed her face as she stepped over my threshold and into my home. The silence was broken. The sanctuary was breached. The afternoon was no longer quiet, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the rules of my life had just been irrevocably and perhaps wonderfully destroyed. I let her in not out of kindness, and certainly not out of forgiveness. I let her in because to close the door would have been an admission of defeat, a retreat into a world she had already proven was a fragile illusion. I stepped aside, the cool air from the hall washing over my bare feet, and she entered my home as if she had a right to be there. The heavy front door swung shut behind her with a soft, definitive click, a sound that sealed us inside together, severing the moment from the world outside. The very atmosphere of my house shifted, the curated silence now charged with her presence, the air itself seeming to grow thicker, heavier. She moved through my living room with a slow, deliberate grace that was unnerving. There was no hesitation in her step, no awkwardness of an uninvited guest. Instead, she walked with an air of appraisal, a quiet ownership that made my skin crawl. Her posture was erect, her movements fluid, as she drifted past the furniture I had spent a lifetime selecting. I watched her, a silent observer in my own domain, analyzing the line of her back, the slight sway of her hips, the way her presence seemed to both clash with and complete the sterile perfection of the room. I felt less like a homeowner and more like a curator, watching a visitor interact with an exhibit that was suddenly, terrifyingly alive. Her gaze was an inventory, a slow, methodical cataloging of my life. It swept over the silver-framed photographs on the console table, decades of frozen smiles from vacations and holidays. It lingered on the towering shelves of art books, their spines unbroken, their pages pristine. Her eyes finally settled on the large crystal vase in the center of the room, filled with a bouquet of white lilies. Their scent, which I usually found calming, now seemed cloying and oppressive, a funereal sweetness that filled the space between us. In her silent observation, I felt my life being weighed, measured, and perhaps for the first time, truly seen by someone other than myself. She stopped at the fireplace, her back to me, and reached for a small bronze statuette on the mantelpiece. It was a dancer, frozen mid-motion, an award I had won in college for a performance that felt like it belonged to another person in another lifetime. She did not just pick it up, she cradled it in her palm, her thumb tracing the elegant curve of the dancer's spine with a shocking intimacy. It was a gesture so personal it felt like a violation, as if her fingers were tracing that same line on my own skin. A cold fire, not of rage, but of pure crystalline shock, ignited deep within me. This was no longer just about my husband. This was about me. Then she turned. The space that had separated us collapsed as she took one step, and then another, closing the distance with the same unnerving purpose. I remained rooted to the spot, my feet feeling as though they had been fused to the polished floorboards. I was not paralyzed by fear, but by a strange hypnotic fascination, a need to see this impossible scene through to its conclusion. The air vibrated, charged with the scent of lilies and her perfume, and the unspoken truth that hung between us. My own heartbeat was a frantic drum against my ribs, the only sound in a world that had suddenly gone quiet. She stopped so close I could feel the warmth radiating from her body. She raised a hand, her movements unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. I expected a blow, a push, some act of aggression to finally release the tension. Instead, her fingers, impossibly gentle, came to rest against my cheek. The contact was electric, a soft, warm pressure that sent a tremor through my entire body. It was not a gesture of violence or even of confrontation. It was a question, an offering, an act of profound and terrifying intimacy that shattered the last of my composure. The anger I had been waiting for, the righteous fury of a wronged wife, never arrived. It simply failed to materialize, dissolving into something I could not name. In that moment, looking into her dark, desperate eyes, feeling the warmth of her hand on my skin, I saw not the architect of my pain, but a mirror. I saw the same loneliness that haunted the quiet corners of my perfect house, the same unspoken hunger for a touch that meant more than just habit. The ghost of my husband, the man who was the supposed center of this drama, faded into irrelevance. He was no longer the prize to be fought over. He was merely the pretext, the catalyst that had brought this woman to my door. I did not pull away. Instead, I leaned into her touch, a fractional, almost imperceptible movement that was a surrender and a confession all at once. My own hand rose, covering hers where it rested on my cheek, my fingers closing over her slender ones. I felt the frantic, bird-like flutter of her pulse beneath my thumb. Her eyes searched mine, and in their depths, I saw the end of one life and the terrifying, exhilarating beginning of another. She leaned closer still, and the world narrowed to the space between our faces, the scent of lilies, and the silent question her lips were about to ask. The fury I should have felt was a phantom, a ghost emotion that never fully materialized. In its place settled a strange, viscous calm, a suspension of reality where the normal rules of anger and betrayal no longer applied. Her hand remained on my cheek, a point of impossible warmth in the refrigerated air of my living room. Under the pressure of her touch, I could feel the carefully constructed walls of my life begin to buckle, the foundations shifting beneath my feet. The woman before me was no longer a rival, no longer the faceless affair I had vaguely suspected. She was a presence, real and terrifyingly human, and in her eyes I saw not a threat, but a reflection. It was a distorted mirror, showing me a younger, fiercer version of myself, but a mirror nonetheless. I saw in her gaze the same aching loneliness that echoed through the empty rooms of my house, the same quiet desperation for a connection that went deeper than shared routines and polite dinner conversations. My husband, the man who theoretically connected us, began to dissolve into the background. He was no longer the central figure in this drama. He was merely the shared landscape of our separate griefs, the common ground upon which we now stood, facing each other, not as enemies, but as survivors of the same emotional drought. My hand, which still covered hers, tightened its grip. It was not a gesture of restraint, but one of solidarity, an anchor in the sudden, dizzying vertigo that had overtaken me. I felt the delicate bones of her hand beneath my own, the surprising strength in her fingers, the frantic, trapped bird flutter of her pulse. It was the pulse of a life lived at a higher frequency than my own, a life of raw emotion and impulsive acts, and I felt a strange and dangerous pull towards its heat. We stood like that for a long moment, locked together by a touch that was both an accusation and a plea, the world outside my windows fading into an indistinct blur. She took a final, infinitesimal step forward. The space between us vanished entirely, and the soft fabric of her clothes brushed against mine. The subtle scent of her perfume, the one I had smelled on my own silk negligee, was no longer an assault, but an intoxicating presence, a complex blend of sweetness and musk that seemed to tell a story I suddenly wanted to read. I could feel the heat of her breath on my face, feel the rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. It was the most intimate I had been with another person in years, a proximity that was more charged and alive than any routine embrace from my husband. Her head tilted, a slow, deliberate movement that felt both rehearsed and utterly spontaneous. And then her lips found mine. The initial contact was hesitant, a soft, questioning pressure that held a universe of unspoken things. It tasted of salt, the ghost of unshed tears, and a faint sweetness like bruised fruit. There was no artifice in it, no seduction, only a raw and honest vulnerability that disarmed me completely. It was a kiss that asked for nothing, yet offered everything, a silent exploration of the precipice upon which we both stood. My own response was involuntary, a betrayal of every vow I had ever made, and yet it felt like the truest thing I had done in decades. My lips parted under hers, a silent invitation, a surrender. The kiss deepened, shifting from a hesitant question to a declarative statement. It was a confirmation of our shared isolation, a commingling of our separate pains. In that moment, the sterile living room, the photographs on the wall, the scent of lilies, it all ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of her mouth, the desperate, searching pressure of her lips, and the shocking realization that this felt more like coming home than anything I had ever known. This was not about desire, not in the simple physical sense. It was about recognition. It was the sudden, shattering understanding that the emptiness I carried within me had a twin, and it was standing right in front of me. The betrayal of my husband, which should have been a chasm between us, became the very bridge we were now crossing. His infidelity had not torn us apart. It had forged a strange, illicit, and unbreakable bond between us, weaving our separate narratives into a single, complicated tapestry. I could feel the tension drain from her body as I responded, a subtle release of a breath she had been holding for an eternity. Her hands, which had been frozen at her sides, came up to frame my face, her thumbs stroking my jawline with a tenderness that made my eyes burn. It was a gesture of such profound comfort and acceptance that it felt like an absolution. She was not just my husband's mistress. She was my confessor, my conspirator, the only other person on the planet who could possibly understand the precise shape of my heartbreak. When the kiss finally broke, we remained forehead to forehead, breathing the same air. The silence that returned was different now. It was no longer a void, but a shared space, a sanctuary we had created in the ruins of my marriage. I looked into her eyes, and the desperation I had seen earlier was gone, replaced by a dawning wonder, a reflection of my own bewildered awe. We were two strangers, bound by the lies of one man, standing on the precipice of a truth that was both terrifying and undeniably beautiful. I led her upstairs. The action felt both dreamlike and inevitable, as if my feet knew the path, even if my mind was still reeling. We ascended the grand, curving staircase, my hand trailing along the polished mahogany banister, a familiar anchor in a world that had become, suddenly, thrillingly unfamiliar. Each step was a deliberate act, a conscious choice to move further away from the life I knew and deeper into this new, unwritten territory. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft whisper of our bare feet on the plush runner, a sound that seemed to amplify the intimacy of our shared ascent into the private heart of my home. The master bedroom was bathed in the soft, forgiving light of the late afternoon. Dust motes danced in the golden shafts of sun streaming through the shears, illuminating a space that had, until this moment, been the epicenter of my loneliness. It was a room curated for a perfect marriage, a showroom of tranquil blues and creams, a place where passion had long ago cooled into the comfortable embers of habit. Bringing her here felt like a sacrilege, a deliberate desecration of a shrine I no longer believed in. It was a reclamation, a defiant act of painting over a faded masterpiece with bold, vibrant, and dangerous new colors. Here, in this room that was so intimately mine, so profoundly a symbol of my marriage, she seemed to shed the last of her uncertainty. She stood in the center of the room, a dark, vivid silhouette against the pale light, and she belonged there in a way that felt both shocking and profoundly right. This was the battlefield, the stage upon which the silent dramas of my life had been played out, and her presence here was the final act, the climax no one, least of all me, could have ever predicted. She was not an intruder. She was the missing piece, the catalyst that would finally shatter the elegant, empty stillness of the scene. We began to undress each other. There were no words, no fumbled negotiations, only a slow, ritualistic shedding of the lives we had worn just moments before. My fingers worked at the buttons of her simple cotton blouse, each one a small release, a quiet declaration. Her hands, equally steady, moved to the zipper at the back of my dress. It was a dance of mutual discovery, a silent language of touch that spoke more eloquently than any words could. The clothes pooled at our feet in soft piles of silk and linen, forgotten skins, leaving our bodies exposed to the light and to each other's gaze. Her body was a study in taut lines and smooth, unbroken curves, a testament to a youth I could only dimly remember. My own body, marked by time and the faint, silvery lines of experience, felt suddenly venerable, powerful in its own history. We stood before each other, not as rivals comparing flaws, but as two distinct landscapes, each with its own unique and intricate geography. There was no shame in the silence, no judgment, only a profound and overwhelming sense of recognition. The feeling of seeing and being seen with an honesty that was utterly new. The bed, a vast expanse of pristine white Egyptian cotton, awaited us. It was the bed I had shared with my husband for 2 decades, a space that had witnessed the slow, almost imperceptible cooling of our connection. Lying down on those sheets with her felt like claiming new territory. Our dark skin against the stark white was a startling, beautiful contrast, a visual representation of the lines we were crossing. The familiar scent of the lavender linen spray was now mingled with her unique fragrance, creating a new and intoxicating blend that marked the space as ours alone. There was no urgency in our touch, no frantic haste. It was an exploration, a slow, languid mapping of skin and bone. My fingers traced the delicate line of her collarbone, the gentle slope of her shoulder, the surprising softness of the skin at the small of her back. Her hands, in turn, discovered the curve of my hip, the texture of a small scar on my thigh, the places where my body held the silent stories of my life. It was a form of worship, a sacred act of learning each other through touch, a conversation conducted entirely through our fingertips. Her mouth followed the path her hands had blazed, leaving a trail of warm, damp kisses across my skin. It was a reverence I had not felt in years, a deliberate, focused attention that made my body feel cherished, awakened. I had forgotten that my skin could feel like this, that a simple touch could ignite a cascade of sensation that had nothing to do with duty or expectation. This was not about release, it was about discovery. It was about reclaiming a part of myself I had thought was lost forever, buried under years of quiet complicity and unspoken compromises. When our bodies finally joined, it was not a collision, but a merging. It was a slow, deep slide into a warmth that felt both new and anciently familiar. There was no script, no learned routine, only the intuitive, synchronous movement of two bodies speaking the same silent language of need. The sounds we made were not of pleasure alone, but of a profound, soul-deep release, the quiet sighs of two lonely travelers who had, against all odds, finally found their way home. In the fading light of the afternoon, tangled in the white sheets of my marriage bed, we created a new world, a fragile, beautiful, and utterly blasphemous sanctuary for two. The morning broke, soft and gray, filtering through the shears in a diffuse, dreamlike haze. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than before. The oppressive, waiting silence had been replaced by a soft, settled peace, the comfortable silence of shared space. We moved around the kitchen in an easy, unspoken choreography, a rhythm established in mere hours that felt more natural than the one I had practiced for 2 decades. She made coffee, the rich, dark aroma filling the air, while I took down my favorite ceramic mugs, their familiar weight a grounding presence in my hands. There was no awkwardness, no need to fill the space with words. We sat at the kitchen table, the one where my husband and I usually read the papers in silence, and the quiet felt not like a void, but like a warm blanket. I watched the way the pale morning light caught the curve of her neck, the way she cradled the mug in her hands, her dark eyes thoughtful as she gazed out at the manicured garden. The gnawing tension that had been my constant companion for years, the low hum of dissatisfaction that lived just beneath the surface of my perfect life, was gone. In its place was a strange, terrifying, and utterly profound sense of calm. We spent the day adrift, exploring the quiet corners of the house and each other. We lay on the thick rug in the library, reading poetry aloud, our legs tangled together, her head resting in my lap. Her fingers traced the lines on my palm as if reading a map, and I felt a sense of being known, of being seen, that was both unnerving and deeply comforting. The house, which had often felt like a beautiful, sterile museum, was finally alive, filled with the soft sounds of our laughter and the hushed tones of our shared stories. It was no longer his house or my house. It was ours. Afternoon bled into evening, a new kind of energy began to build between us. The comfortable intimacy of the day gave way to a slow, simmering heat, a magnetic pull that was impossible to ignore. It started with a lingering touch as we passed in the hallway. A look held a second too long across the living room. We were orbiting each other, two celestial bodies drawn together by an invisible, inexorable source. The air grew thick with anticipation, every brush of skin a spark, every shared glance a promise. I found her in the living room, standing before the cold fireplace, bathed in the amber glow of a single lamp. The rest of the room was cloaked in shadows, a private, intimate world for two. I came up behind her, my hands finding her waist, my body pressing against the length of her back. She leaned into me, her head falling back against my shoulder with a soft sigh of surrender. My lips found the sensitive skin of her neck, tasting the salt and sweetness of her, breathing in her scent. A tremor ran through her body, and I felt her response as a deep, resonant hum against my own. Her hands came up to cover mine at her waist, her fingers lacing through my own. I turned her slowly, deliberately, until we were face to face in the dim light. Her eyes were dark, pupils wide with a mixture of desire and something else, something deeper. I lowered her to the floor, onto the plush, expensive rug that had only ever known the weight of fine furniture. The rough texture of the wool was a sensual contrast to the softness of her skin as I slowly, reverently peeled away the layers of her clothing, my own following soon after. The lamplight cast long, dancing shadows across our bodies, turning our intertwined forms into a living sculpture of light and darkness. This was different from the day before. The gentle exploration had been replaced by a fierce, hungry need, a desire to consume and be consumed. My mouth was everywhere, tasting, learning, memorizing the landscape of her body, while her hands were in my hair, on my back, pulling me closer, her nails scraping lightly against my skin in a desperate, pleading rhythm. She was on top of me, her hips moving with a slow, hypnotic race, her eyes locked on mine. In her gaze, I saw not just passion, but a raw, aching vulnerability, a silent plea for connection that mirrored my own. I reached up, my hands tangling in her hair, and pulled her down for a kiss that was deep and punishing and full of everything we couldn't say. Her body arched against mine, a low sound of pure pleasure catching in her throat, a sound that resonated deep within my own core. It was in that precise moment of shared, shattering release that we heard it, the sound of a key in the front door. He stood in the archway between the hall and the living room, a silhouette against the brighter light behind him. His briefcase dropped from his hand, hitting the polished hardwood floor with a loud, discordant thud that echoed the sudden, violent stopping of my own heart. The scene before him was illuminated in the single pool of lamplight like a theatrical tableau. Two naked women on his living room floor, the scent of sex and perfume hanging heavy in the air, his wife's body tangled with the body of his mistress. He didn't speak. He didn't rage or yell or demand an explanation. He simply stood there, frozen, his face a canvas of disbelief slowly curdling into a dawning, sickening horror. He looked from her face, flushed and beautiful in the afterglow, to my face, and the connection between us was a palpable, living thing in the space, an invisible cord of intimacy that he could see as clearly as if it were a rope. He was not just witnessing an act of infidelity. He was witnessing the birth of a new world, a world in which he had been rendered utterly, irrevocably obsolete. His carefully constructed life, his two separate secret worlds, had not just collided, they had merged and formed an alliance against him, leaving him on the outside, a ghost in the ruins of his own making. He did not erupt. There was no tidal wave of rage, no thunderous accusation that I had braced myself for. Instead, a terrifying silence descended upon the room, a vacuum that sucked all the air and heat from our illicit tableau. He simply stood in the archway, a statue carved from shock, his face a mask of utter incomprehension. His gaze flickered between us, not with anger, but with a profound and horrifying confusion, like a man who had walked into his own home, only to find the furniture had rearranged itself into a language he could not read. Without a word, without a single glance back, he turned and walked out. The front door closed behind him with a soft, final click that seemed to echo in the sudden stillness of the house. He didn't slam it in anger. He closed it with the quiet resignation of a man admitting utter and absolute defeat. We were left in the amber glow of the single lamp, our bodies still intertwined on the rug. The silence he left behind, somehow louder and more damning than any shouting match could have been. A tremor went through her body, a delayed reaction of shock or fear, and she scrambled off me, pulling a discarded silk blouse around her shoulders like a shield. I remained on the floor, the rough texture of the rug biting into my bare back, feeling strangely calm, hollowed out. The dramatic climax I might have once feared had been a quiet, pathetic fizzle, a retreat so complete it was almost insulting. The great man of the house, the king of his 2 castles, had been dethroned not by a dramatic battle, but by a silent coup he hadn't even seen coming. She came to me then, her movements hesitant. She didn't try to comfort me or ask the frantic, useless questions that would normally follow such a scene. Instead, she knelt beside me on the floor, her presence a quiet anchor in the suddenly vast and empty room. Her eyes searched mine, not for answers, but for confirmation, for a sign that the new world we had just created had not been immediately destroyed by the old one's departure. And in that moment, as she knelt before me, I understood. This was never about him. He was merely the pretext, the broken gate through which she had entered my life. She had not come to my house to steal a husband I no longer wanted. She had come to offer herself as a replacement, not for him, but for the void he had left behind. She was offering me a devotion he was incapable of, a worship that was intoxicating in its purity, an adoration that asked for nothing in return but to be accepted. She lowered her head, a gesture of profound submission, and rested it in my lap. Her hair was a soft, dark weight against my thighs. Her body curled at my feet like a supplicant. My hand moved of its own accord, my fingers sinking into the thick, soft strands of her hair. It was not a gesture of passion, but one of ownership, of acceptance. It was the sealing of a silent, unholy pact made in the ruins of my former life. As my fingers stroked her hair, a cold, thrilling sense of power washed over me, a feeling so potent it was almost sickening. I had not been defeated, I had conquered. I had lost a husband, but gained a disciple, a beautiful, pliant creature who saw me not as a wife to be ignored, but as a goddess to be worshipped. She had come to fill the emptiness, not with the flawed and clumsy love of a man, but with something far more potent, her entire self. The old grandfather clock in the hall began to chime, its deep, resonant tolls marking the hour. Each chime was a nail in the coffin of my old life, and a bell heralding the beginning of this new, monstrous, and exquisitely perfect one. I looked down at the woman in my lap, this beautiful, broken thing I now owned, and I felt not a shred of guilt, only the terrifying, triumphant peace of a queen who had finally, after a long and silent war, ascended to her throne.